Well, we are in a series called The Light of the World, and that is what we've been talking about the past couple weeks as we lead up to Christmas. I just sat down, and Morgan shared with me, she had sent me a picture of a Facebook post that about our deal yesterday, and I just want to read you, this was the post yesterday from our Be Rich. It says, big thanks, and I want you guys to hear this, not because I'm trying to brag or blah, 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 but we get to be the ones that get to distribute a lot of this money from Be Rich, and it says, big thanks goes to Grace Church of the Nazarene today. They were at Motomart filling up gas tanks for free in all caps. It says, you pulled up, they ran their credit card and even pumped the gas for me. Christmas time is a very hard time for us, and to think someone did this for me made me tear up. I even asked the guy if I could give him a hug, which he said yes. So if you are a member of this congregation, please know how much it was appreciated, and thank you. So that's to you guys, and I just wanted to share that. And yeah, it's awesome stuff. Never gets old being generous, and you can't outgive God, and He is, in fact, the light of the world that came to this earth. And so I want to continue today, and I have an agenda. Today I have a very specific agenda, so I want to be up front with that. And so I don't, in case you have to leave earlier, in case that you're not blindsided by the agenda. But here's the thing. Here's what I want to talk about. If you're here and at some point in time in your life, you were introduced to a guy named Jesus. I don't know if that was at Bible school or Sunday school, or at some point in time, maybe your parents did, and you were in a relationship, and you made a decision to follow Christ, and you did that, but for some reason or another, you wandered away. If you were in a relationship, maybe you prayed a prayer at some point in time that said, hey, forgive me of my sins, or you grew up in church and wandered away, and you had a bad experience, because a lot of us have had bad experiences at church, and that's just a thing. I mean, we've all, at some point in time, run onto somebody who called themselves a Christian that really didn't act like it, or was very, hypocritical or whatever. So I don't know what that is for you. And so my agenda here this morning is, and maybe you went to college and you quit believing, or there was some kind of incredible tragedy in your life and you were angry at God and you were mad and you wanted to walk away, and you just have separated yourself from this light of the world that came at Christmas and this guy named Jesus. And maybe it was something that you learned about the Bible and that kind of threw you off, or for whatever it is. So my agenda here this morning is, if that's you, if you fit into one of those categories, if you're somebody that maybe has just grown up in church and been a follower of Jesus Christ, and maybe you've wandered away and you've allowed stuff to creep in, and we all have gotten busy, or whatever it is. So if that's your story, and if that's your story, that's cool, because I'm not judging you if that's your story, if you've wandered away, or maybe you're somebody here this morning that hasn't ever made that decision to follow Christ, and you haven't got your head wrapped around what that even means and who Jesus is. But if you are, in the next few minutes that I speak, that you don't look at me or my sweater and be distracted by my sweater, but here's my agenda. In the next few minutes, in the next several minutes that we're going to be sitting here, that you would in some way, that I could urge you to re-engage, or would you consider to re-engage the faith that you had as a child? Would you be willing to take a step in the direction of God in the next few minutes? Would you be willing to do that? And I don't know what that step looks like for you. It may be, your step is, well, hey, I'm here, but I'm just here because somebody invited me to be here. Maybe your step is like, I don't really know. Maybe it's just, I'm going to show up at church next week. And maybe that's your step. Maybe you begin to pray. Maybe that's your step. Maybe and it could sound something like, hey, God, you know what? I haven't talked to you in a really long time, but I want to talk to you today. Or maybe I don't know what that step is for each one of you, but you would take a step, and let me urge you to take a step to reconnect with God and with the faith of your childhood. And that's really what that looks like. I don't know what that step is. Maybe it's to join a grow group, jump into Faith 101 after the first of the year, join Bible 101, maybe start serving in the nursery or the kids area, or be willing to teach. I don't know what that looks like. So we're all on in our faith and our walk with Christ. And so, but today, I'd like every person here who made some kind of profession of faith as a child, maybe you were baptized, maybe you grew up in church and wandered away, who was pushed away by the church or had a bad experience, who met a girl or a guy and they pulled them away, just to come back and re-engage. So that's my agenda. Just been very upfront with you this morning on what I want to accomplish, is to get you at some point in time to re-engage for whatever that looks like for you in this Christmas, to the childhood, or to the belief of your childhood, or maybe that first experience that you had with Jesus in the church. And so you just can't seem to, and for whatever that is, maybe it's, I think in each one of us there's that voice that we hear, and that it's that voice that says, well, you really ought to, or you should do this, or it's that thing that kind of elbows your conscience, and it's that, for all of us, I don't care if you're a church person or you're a non-church person, it's that voice inside of you that says, hey, you really probably ought to go to church, or you should start praying more, or you really probably should get involved more. And you remember, I really ought to, but I got busy and then I didn't. And you remember why you quit doing, and it was that little voice inside you that tells you that you should do something. And maybe it's that little voice that says, you know what, I used to believe, but now I don't. And you're here at church, and how did that happen? And so for whatever that is, we believe, and I think at some point in time, you believe that voice, that little voice that urges you to get up and put clothes on and come to church, and that little voice that urges you to crack open your Bible, or that little voice that you have inside you, we believe that is the light of the world speaking to you, whether you believe that or not. And I think maybe some of you probably believe that at some point in time in your life. But that's it. That's the goal. It's just to get you to reconsider your relationship with Jesus and Christmas. Is that fair enough? So that's what I want you to do. And really, I want you to just answer that question for you. And really, the primary question, I don't care if you have been a believer for 100 years, or if you've been, or you're just not there yet, and you're here today and you're an unchurched person, and you're like, I really don't get this. I don't understand why you guys raise your hands. I don't understand why you guys do a lot of what you do. I don't really believe what you do. I don't even know if I believe in Jesus. I'm not sure I believe that God is real, and why do bad things happen to good people, and all of that stuff. Whatever that is, you have to answer the question of who is Jesus, because he was a real person that came to this earth as a baby and laid in a manger and walked the face of the earth. He was crucified. He's not a fairy tale. He's not some kind of Christmas story. It's real history, and I want to talk a little bit about that history today. And so that's really what. But in order to reconsider and to re-engage with your relationship with Jesus, and in order to re-engage with this thing called Christmas and this light of the world, I want to tell you a story, and I want to talk to you about the Christmas story. And who's heard the Christmas story before? Anybody? Okay, pretty much everybody. At some point in time, I don't care unless you've just lived under a rock for decades, you've heard the Christmas story about Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus and the shepherds and the wise men and Herod and everybody else. So I want to ask you the question this morning is, who do you think you identify most with the Christmas story? Which character in the Christmas story do you identify most with? Is it the shepherds? You're like, yeah, maybe, I like farm animals. Or is it the angels? Yeah, probably not. Is it Mary? Yeah, no. Is it Joseph? Maybe. Is it baby Jesus? Yeah, no. Don't identify with him at all. So whoever it is, who is it that you identify most? Which character do you identify most with in the Christmas story? And I got to tell you, for me, and this may come as a surprise, but I think the person that I identify most with in the Christmas story is probably, which most people would consider the villain of Christmas story, is King Herod. And so, and you're like, what? Not, I know some of you had me pegged for the shepherd, but but I think it's really just Herod, and his name is Herod. He's kind of the villain of Christmas. He's the Darth Vader of the Christmas story, isn't he? He's just like Luke, but he's just a bad guy. And I want to tell you a little bit about Herod. He was a king. And Herod was all about the powers that this world can support him and the autonomy and fame. And I think some of us can identify. And I think, here's the reason why. I think all of us have a little bit of Herod in us. There's a little bit of Herod in each one of us. And that's why I identify with it, because he wanted to be king. He wanted all this stuff. He never wanted to gain weight. Never wanted to get old. And we want God to help us, don't we? We want God to help us, not compete with us. And that's really kind of what Herod wanted. And Herod was a client king. I'm going to give you a little bit of history lesson. So I know this can Many of you fell asleep in history, but this is really important to the Christmas story because I don't think we spend a lot of time on the Christmas story, but I don't think we really truly have an understanding of who Herod was. He was a client king of Judea, and he was incredibly smart and talented. He was politically astute. He was a great politician. He was incredibly gifted with his abilities and what God had gifted him with. He was a builder. He rebuilt a temple. He was famous for building aqueducts. He built a Colosseum. He built all kinds of things. He was not Jewish, which was interesting because he was leading Jewish people. And he was the client king over Judea. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. Herod's goal was basically eternal fame and to establish his legacy and his lineage as king of Israel. And it was really important. And so I'm going to tell you one of the favorite Herod stories, okay? And many of you, and maybe in history class or whatever, you learned about Julius Caesar and how Julius Caesar was murdered. If you didn't remember, if you were not a historian and you didn't remember that, Julius Caesar was murdered at this point in time by his Senate. And there was a time, I'm going to throw a couple names. So after the murder of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, Caesar's nephew, Caesar was murdered in 44 BC, and Caesar's nephew, who was Octavian, I'm going to throw that name up there in case you're taking notes. But this is Caesar's nephew, Octavian, and so Octavian would become the Caesar Augustus, but during that time, Octavian and Mark Antony, there's another name, Octavian and Mark Antony began a quest to hunt down the people who murdered Julius Caesar. They set out together to revenge Julius Caesar's death. And so they went on this long campaign to avenge the death of Julius Caesar. Well, you had to know at some point in time there was going to be tension between these two guys because really in Rome and in that day in the kingdom of Rome, there was only room for one sheriff in town. Okay, so Octavian and Mark Antony, who had a very famous wife. Anybody know who Mark Antony's wife was? Cleopatra. Oh, some of you got it. Yes. So Mark Antony had a famous wife, Cleopatra. So Octavian and Mark Antony had kind of joined forces, and they were going to avenge their Julius Caesar's death. And so after they had avenged his death and they'd killed everybody that was responsible, there started to begin this battle for power between Octavian and Mark Antony. And so Herod aligned himself with Mark Antony. And he began to throw lavish parties for Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and the Romans hated Cleopatra because she was just evil and thought that she was going to overtake everything. And so Mark Antony and Cleopatra and Octavian, there became this civil war between the Mark Antony camp and the Octavian camp, and Herod put his hat in the Mark Antony camp. But he bet on the wrong horse. Because once the war happened between Mark Antony and Octavian, this battle for power to see who was going to be the next sheriff in town, Herod had aligned himself with Mark Antony, and then Mark Antony and his camp were quickly defeated. And so now Herod found himself in a precarious position because basically what happened, civil war broke out in 31 BC, Mark Antony and Octavius, and in August, Octavian defeated the eastern leader, and Herod had aligned himself with the loser. So basically, Herod had two choices. Okay, you basically kill myself now, or I can try to run and hide because I know Octavian, since I aligned myself with his enemy, is going to be hunting me down to kill me. But Herod did something that was incredibly bold. And I know this is kind of boring, it's a history lesson, but this is so critical to where we are today. Herod did something amazing, and he went over to the island where the new Caesar Augustus, which was Octavian, in other words, his enemy, went to see him. And they knocked on the door, and people were like, "What are you doing here? Herod's here." And Octavian was like, "What? Who's here? That my enemy? The guy that aligned himself with Mark Antony and was my enemy? He's at my door to talk to me?" And he's like, "Yeah." So they let him in. And so Herod gives this incredible speech. And he basically says, "Hey, listen, here's the deal. He tells this, he's like, I aligned myself with Mark Antony, your enemy, but I want you to know that when I align myself with someone, I am loyal to the end. And now, Caesar, I am loyal to you." And Caesar Octavian, who was the new Caesar Augustus, was blown away by that. He was like, wow, because Herod was incredibly smart. He was a great politician, and he was always covering his bases. And so that's what he did. And so instead of fleeing Egypt and preparing, he sailed to the island of Rhodes, and met with Octavian. And then Octavian, instead of killing Herod at that point in time, added the coast of Judea and Samaria and Jericho and Gaza to Herod's control. And so Herod was just ambition controlled. And he made a bunch of stupid decisions. And he burnt anger. He had 10 wives. He had several sons. 4 times he changed his will and leaving the kingdom to a different son. And then the son would do something stupid, and he would have that son killed. Over and over that happened. He killed his wife. He'd kill rabbis, and he'd kill another son when he was like, okay, well, I killed him. Now you're in charge. And then he would do something dumb, and he would kill that son. And then he'd go to the next son. And then finally his sons were like, no, really, seriously, Dad. No, you know what? I don't even want to be king. Don't pick me, because he was just this ruthless leader. He killed wives. He killed rabbis in Judea. He was consumed with trying to control the future, and he wanted to control his kingdom to the grave, and he protected his name and his legacy by trying to control chaos in the areas that he governed. And so Herod, fast forward, is 70 years old, and he is sick with a kidney infection. Incredibly painful kidney disease, and he's angry, he's hurting, and he's angry, and toward the very end of life, he was very, very sick, and he was trying to figure out how to control the future from his grave. How am I going to maintain control after I'm gone? And he received some really disturbing news, and the disturbing news was that 5 miles south, a baby had been born, and he was a toddler, and he was learning to walk, and his name was Jesus. And it made him furious. And so here's what we have. So here's how Matthew introduced the story. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, and we got a little bit of scripture here, but we're going to get through it. He says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem and in Judea, during the time of King Herod, the Magi, or wise men, we've called them wise men, from the east came to Jerusalem. And he asked, and the Magi asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? And everybody else is like, shh, don't say that too loud. Seriously, if Herod gets word of this, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw the star arose, and we have come to worship it. And then in verse 3, it says, when Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem was disturbed with him. And so now that you have a little bit of the background of what kind of a person Herod was, and he was all about himself. He was all about furthering his kingdom. He was all about, how can I maintain control of my kingdom? And when Herod was upset, it was dangerous. People died. And so when these wise men come bouncing into town and say, oh, where's this king of the Jews that we heard has been born? Everybody's like, shut up. Are you kidding? What, are you trying to get us all killed? Keep that under your hat. And so when Herod heard the news, verse 3, it says he was disturbed. And when Herod was disturbed, people died. He was a cranky old man in a ton of pain. Verse 4, when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, and I can't imagine being some of those guys. They're like, well, here we go. We're gonna get our heads chopped off. He called together all these chief priests and teachers of the law and asked them, where is the Messiah to be born? I know you guys know this. The teachers of the law, which would have been the Jewish law, Herod had to call them all in, and it's like, hey, I know you know where Jesus is supposed to be born because prophecy. He knew enough about it, but he wasn't Jewish, so he had to ask Jewish people. And they were like, well, duh, Herod, you should know this. You're the leader of the Jews. But he was, and so they proceed to tell him in verse 5, in Bethlehem in Judea. They replied, for that is what the prophet has written. And it's in Malachi 5:2 if you want to find that prophecy. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd the people of Israel. So in other words, these teachers of the law were brought in. Herod's like, where's the baby to be born? And they were like, hey, it's going to be Bethlehem, because that's what the prophecy has told us. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out the exact time the star had appeared. Because why? Because Herod had an agenda. He couldn't imagine a toddler king being born on his watch. Herod called the Magi secretly. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child as soon as you find him. I mean, as soon as you find him, as soon as you find out where that baby is, report it to me. This is Herod speaking. So that I too may go and worship him. Baloney. You don't want to worship him. You want to kill him. And so the Magi went to Bethlehem. And after they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star that they'd seen rose and went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they, the Magi, saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child and his mother, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Isn't that incredible? And I think when we hear the word worship in church, and I'm guilty of it too, we'll say, okay, we're going to stand and worship. We think, okay, Jeremy's got to come up here. But the Magi had it right. When you look at the word worship, it's not necessarily singing. It's basically being in the presence of something awesome. And they fell on their face because of who they believed that little baby was. They came from miles and miles away to see that little baby. They gave him gifts, and they followed a light, and they worshiped him. And 5 miles away, Herod is livid. He is furious. He's like looking down the road. Have you seen those guys? I told them to come right back here and report to me. Go out and look at the road and see if they're coming back. Have you seen them? Where are they? He's pacing the floor. He is ticked off. He is mad because he's so worried about controlling things. His whole life had been about preserving, protecting, and controlling. And he's not about to bow his knee to this little baby. And he's not about to worship anyone or anything but himself. And that's why I say there's always a little bit of Herod in each one of us. Because I think some of us to say things like, I don't mind leveraging God if it's going to help me out. If it's going to help my situation, if it's going to, I don't mind tithing if I'm going to get something back in return. I don't mind going to church or reading the Bible or saying a prayer if there's something in it for me. If all of that will help me, I'm fine. But the whole idea of writing God a blank check with my life is not something that goes easy or goes down easy for any of us, does it? It's because we all have a little bit of Herod in us. The whole idea of writing God a blank check with our life and allowing him to control my destiny, are you kidding me? Allowing him to control my finances? No, thank you. Allowing him to control my career or my family or my decisions or my fun? Surrendering my life? I don't think so. Why? Because we all have a little bit of the nasty Herod in us. And we're basically saying, this thought of basically saying, yes, God. Now, what was the question? Doesn't fit with us naturally. It doesn't come natural to us, does it? Why? Because there's a little bit of Herod in us all. And so the story continues in verse 12. And after being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they, the Magi, returned to their country a different route. So they were like, hey, we got to find a different route home because this guy's wanting to, no telling what he's going to do to us. When they had gone, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph, which is Jesus' dad, earthly dad. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child and kill him. So Joseph grabs Mary, this 14-year-old bride, and this tiny little baby, and they head out to Egypt and escape. The Magi never returned to Herod, and he is ticked off. And remember, when Herod was furious, bad things happened. He spent his entire life controlling the outcomes. He was a master of controlling outcomes, and this one was slipping through his fingers. And a baby king and some Jewish parents weren't about to outsmart Herod. And he decided whatever happened, the toddler king wasn't going to win, and he gave orders. He gave an order in this next verse that you and I can't even fathom the horror of it. He gave an order in verse 16. And it says this. And he gave orders to kill all of the boys in Bethlehem and in its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he learned from the Magi. He gave an order, and at that moment, in the area of Judea, legions went out and pounded on doors and drug mothers out with their babies and murdered little 2-year-old little boys and younger, one by one. All throughout the land, mothers grasping to their child, being ripped out of their arms and seeing their sons, their infant sons, murdered in front of their face. Why? Because he wasn't about to let some Jewish parents and a baby. He said, okay, if you're not going to bring me the child, if you're not going to show me where Jesus is, if you're not going to come back here and tell me where he is, then we're going to opt for the nuclear option, and we're just going to kill them all. And all over Judea, mothers and parents and probably family members were murdered trying to protect their babies. And Mary had to live with the knowledge of that. Can you imagine? Soon, probably later that year, Herod died an incredibly painful death. So painful that he attempted suicide, but his cousin came in and stopped him. And Josephus stated that Herod was so concerned. Listen to this. This is how much Herod wanted to control his destiny or his kingdom or his legacy. Josephus stated that Herod was so concerned that no one would mourn his death that he commanded a large group of distinguished men from the community in Jericho to be imprisoned. And he gave an order that on the hour that he died, all of those distinguished men and well-respected men in that community were to be murdered. And he gave that order so that he had some sense of peace of mind that there would be some mourning on the day that he died. Because he knew that the moment that he passed away, there was going to be a party. And so he wanted to ensure and control his destiny even beyond his grave. He was holding on that tight. Verse 19, after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream in Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So in a twist of history, Herod the Great, is what they called him, became a footnote in history. Imagine trying to explain that to him. Hey, Herod, here's the great news. Here's the thing. There's going to be a group of people sitting. There are people from years and years and years, and for thousands of years, people are going to read about you. They're going to read about your story and who you were. People in 2018 in Salem, Illinois, are going to be sitting in blue puffy chairs and are going to be telling the story about your life. Isn't that awesome, Herod? Your legacy is going to live on. You know, you're going to be talked about. But here's the bad news, Herod. You're simply just a B character in this story. You're just a footnote in the story of a toddler king named Jesus. They won't be talking about the temple you built. They won't be talking about their magnificent seaport and the aqueducts. Herod the builder will be known as Herod the butcher. And you were 5 miles away from the King of Kings, Herod, and you missed it. You were so close, yet you were so insecure and too scared and too obsessed and too controlling to see that you were so close to the King of Kings named Jesus. Fast forward 80 years later, Herod was gone, dead and gone. Jesus had grown up to be a man, had ministered, had done amazing things, was arrested, crucified, and resurrected. Nero, Tiberius were gone. 80 years later, the temple had been destroyed. And John, who had seen it all, remember from last week, John, who had witnessed it all, had walked with Jesus, had held the hand of Mary at the crucifixion and had taken care of her his entire life and had heard the stories firsthand from Mary's mouth. John, who had seen all of his friends executed, and John, who had witnessed it all, says this in John chapter 1, verse 4. In him was life, and that was the light of mankind. And he used past tense there. In him was life, and the life was the light of all mankind. Past tense, and I don't know if he paused or what, but the very next verse, he changes the tense from past tense to present tense. And it's something that you can easily miss in Scripture when you read this. But in verse 5, it says, the light shines. Didn't say shined. It shines in darkness. There is light. It's present tense, and all darkness shall not overcome it. No matter what you do, no matter what Herods there are in the world, no matter what happens in our lives, no matter what tragedy you face, no matter what kind of heartache that you feel, the light has not gone out. And so I'm going to ask the band to come up. That brings us to us, really. All of that story is amazing, and you get the history of that story, but that brings us to where we are. And I just pay attention to us when I ask the band to come up. Don't focus on them. I just want you to ask yourself a question. What will your story be in relation to the light of the world? That was Herod's story in relation to the light of the world. What will your story be in relation to the light of the world? Will it be a story of resistance? Or will it be a story of worship? Will your story have been one that you resisted or that you worshiped? Will you have built your own kingdom and participated in it and been so concerned that this kingdom that you're building here on this earth, everything that you can accumulate, everything that we can accumulate, everything that the stuff that we surround ourselves, how much stuff we buy for Christmas, what kind of house we're going to, what kind of junk that we have around us, my friends and partying and whatever, is it just going to be about your kingdom? Where will your story relate in relationship to the light of the world? Will you have clung to what you would eventually be taking away? Will you have clung to the stuff that eventually is not going to matter? That eventually when we face the end of our lives, it's not going to matter to sense? Will you have clung to that stuff? Will you have surrendered and allowed God to do something bigger than you? Is it my little will be done? Or is it God, your great plan be done? Let me tell you something. We were made for better. And that's why it doesn't matter what you do, what you have, who you date, who you marry, what you drive, what you accomplish. It's not enough. You have been invited, all of us have been invited into the narrative of the light of the world. Do you realize that? In this day and age, in 2018, we have been invited into this story. What part will you play? Because one day, and it's been soon for some, not most, but one day, somebody will tell your story. It happens. 2 funerals last week. someday someone will tell your story. And they will either have to make something up to make you sound good, or they'll tell the truth that you embraced the light of the world. And so this morning, would you take a step to re-engage, maybe even for the first time in your life, with a guy named Jesus? Can I urge you to do that? I'm going to ask you to stand this morning. Would you just take a step to re-engage? I told you up front that was my agenda. Would you take just a step to re-engage with the light of life in you? Would I urge you this morning, this Christmas, to reconnect to the world? He is so incredibly close. Don't miss it. Herod missed it. He was 5 miles away and missed it. Think about what it would mean for you to reconnect. What's that mean for you? Is it to start going back to church? Is it to make church a habit? Is it to get, maybe it's to get our family back to church. Maybe it's you're sitting here and, well, you know what? We really need to get our family back to church. We really need to get engaged in this life. And here's the thing. John, when he wrapped that up, in verse 5, he said, the light shines in darkness. And then he punctuates it. And the darkness has not overcome it. That's why you have that little voice inside you that kind of nudges you, elbows you in your conscience and says, hey, you really ought to do this. You really should do this. Listen to that. Because that is the light of the world inside each of you. And no matter what you've done, no matter what decisions you've made in your life, no matter what kind of a life you've lived up to this time, the darkness will not ever overcome that light in you. Let me pray for you this morning. Father, thank you so much for the light of the world. Lord, I just pray that you would help us as a church and as individuals and as families. And if there's somebody here this morning, Lord, that doesn't know you, I would just pray, Lord, that your Holy Spirit would draw them to connect with the light of the world at this Christmas. Lord, that we don't want to have a story like Herod's. Lord, that is just consumed about ourselves and consumed about our kingdom and what we can accomplish on our own. But Lord, help us to be able to surrender our lives to you in every facet. Our finances, in our free time, Lord, in our relationships, in our church attendance, and everything that we do, Lord. I just pray that you would begin to guide each and every one of us. Lord, I pray that you would just help us to fall down and worship you, and that you would lead us from this place, and that we would feel a little bit more connected with you. I pray, Lord, as we leave, that we would invite our friends and our family, and that we would begin to tell them about this guy named Jesus that is the light of the world and can make all of the difference in our lives. Thank you for your goodness to us this morning, Father, in your precious holy name.